and welcome to Darker Days Radio's Darkhammer, a Worlds of Warhammer podcast. And I'm listening to the Twitch stream, so I'm getting echo from myself there for a minute. That was weird. Anyway, yeah. So I'm joined by Mike, and I'm joined by Eleanor Hingley, who has also written on for Cubicle 7 for Wrath and Glory. Much like myself, I've worked on Wrath and Glory and Warhammer and Age of Sigmar. And Mike is obviously my co-host from Darker Days Radio, who's a big fan of the Warhammer settings. We've talked about Mordheim a lot in the past and other elements of Warhammer. And Eleanor, you just give us a brief overview of other things you write about for gaming, because I think people will know what we've done from previous panels already.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm part of the Wrath and Glory team. Very exciting. I've contributed adventures to 3 DMs Guild anthologies, Uncaged Anthology 2, which is it's volume 2 of the series, and that's feminist reimagining of female monsters. I've just had Book of Seasons Equinoxes come out, which is I wrote a folk horror for that, like a folk horror adventure. And then I've also we're going to have Into the Feywild coming out soon, which I also wrote an adventure for. I've written for a couple of other RPGs, Aegean, which is an ancient Greek mythology RPG, and Voidheart Symphony. I contributed a small amount to that, so that was also very exciting.
Excellent. So really, the whole point about this is to talk about the Warhammer Worlds RPGs, which covers the forthcoming Age of Sigmar Soulbound RPG, the Wrath and Glory RPG, which is a Warhammer 40,000 RPG, and also Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which has its 4th edition. All of those which are in the wheelhouse of Cubicle 7. Now, horror is a predominant element of all of these games. So I think the first topic we should hit upon, because obviously these games are very heavily rooted in the wargaming experience, the miniatures created by Games Workshop, is there is only war, but is there more to horror than just war? So what elements do we feel that we can explore in these games about the horror of war? What do you think these games give us, allow us to at least have some sort of insight into that type of horror? I don't know who wants to jump in with that one. Mike, do you want to start with that?
Well, so it's very interesting. I'm a big fan of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and we were asking about is there more than war? Well, when the first edition came out, there was actually very little focus on that wargaming tradition. It was a very investigatory horror kind of game and setting. And then when the second edition came out, they actually brought in this whole meta plot with the Storm of Chaos to bring in those kind of more war-focused elements. And there was actually some backlash from older players because of that. And we're seeing a very middle ground right now with the 4th edition of that from Cubicle 7, where there is definitely room to explore the aftermath of these titanic battles between the Empire and the forces of chaos, or between the Knights of Bretonnia and maybe the Wood Elves or the Beast Men in the woods, and that sort of thing. So there's obviously a lot of capacity in that setting to explore beyond that, because there's just been so much writing over the past 34 years for that setting, which is focused away from the battlefield and away from war. But of course, when we talk about Warhammer 40,000, that really that didn't have a role-playing game to explore these other parts of the universe until I think it was 2007 that Dark Heresy first came out. So kind of going beyond the miniatures war game and exploring those other elements, I think is really crucial right now for the setting. And there's a lot of excitement because there's new TV shows coming out, live action shows, animated as well. And obviously, there's a brand new version of Wrath and Glory that's about to come out, which I believe you two are writing on. So, I mean, I'll kind of bounce it back to you two to discuss what capacity there is beyond the miniatures battlefield in the Warhammer 40,000's galaxy.
Go for it, Eleanor.
Yeah, I think there's immense capacity for that. That's actually, you know, I got into the 40k setting through the war game, but then, you know, found things like the fiction, you know, that you've got that very strong fictional tradition. And as you say, you've got the kind of that role-playing tradition as well that's more recent, but has focused for a long time on things like inquisitorial bands, rogue traders. You know, it's focused on that idea that there is more than the battlefield, and sometimes that's exploring the kind of the relationships and contexts of the battlefield, but it's not designed to model those things because that capacity already exists within the war game. But I think that one of the things that I love about Wrath and Glory is that it gives you so much scope to explore, you know, like social dilemmas and, you know, lots and lots of different modes, like investigative style of role play. And it has that very strong horror element that I think is actually easier to do in some ways in a role playing game, because not everything on that field has to be defeatable, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, if you have a demon on the board in the war game, it's going to have, you know, it's going to have its soak value, it's going to have its wounds value, it's going to have all of these characteristics, because that's part of the war game itself, and that's part of the sort of the agreement of that war game is if something is on the table, it has to be defeatable. But there are so many more options when you're looking at a role-playing game or you're looking at fiction, that I think that they really give you the capacity to explore.
I think, I mean, as Mike was saying, like, I think Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, while it is in the world of Warhammer Fantasy with Warhammer Fantasy battles and these grand armies fighting each other, whether they're coming from the north with the barbarians of chaos, whether they're coming from Sylvania with the legions of undead led by Manfred von Carstein and all these wonderful vampire characters. But Warhammer, as you said, Mike, is very rooted in investigation, because the Warhammer RPG draws so much from Call of Cthulhu RPG. You see it in its DNA with the percentile system. But that means the characters are immediately set up to, that mindset is already there for an investigation. But I think, Eleanor, as you were saying, it's like, while 40K is all about war, it's a huge galaxy, and there is so much about the horrors of war that is within the fabric of the society, that even if you're not at the front lines at that very moment, you are still experiencing the repercussions of the horror of war. You know, you will be walking across a field which is ready to be turned into farmland for the first time in 1,000 years. Now the orcs have been driven away, maybe, but that means the very soil is fertilized with millions and millions of soldiers of the Imperium. You know, you're going to see bones there and discarded equipment crushed underfoot. So I think that horror of war is something you have to ensure is always in the background of Warhammer settings. You may not be on the front line, but it's there. You feel the repercussions. It ripples through society.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, a lot of the like hive worlds or the machine worlds are going to be in basically like a total war economy. So you can kind of explore that economic horror of what people have to go through in these sorts of situations as they have to, you know, fight for goods and the like, which feels a little too real now that I'm mentioning this. But
Oh, no.
yeah, indeed, that's definitely something that you can easily explore in Warhammer 40,000. Now, it's also really interesting. We don't have too many details, obviously, about the Age of Sigmar Soulbound role-playing game, but when when Age of Sigmar first came out, there was obviously a real focus just on like what kind of battles are going on, where the battlefields like in different realms and terrain and the like. But I think we've seen already from Games Workshop, the owners of the intellectual property, a lot of expansion with things like Shadow over Hammerhall and the Warcry skirmish game to kind of look at how these societies that have developed in these the mortal realms that are floating around in space and time, how these kind of economies work and societies have been set up. And there's really a pretty cool opportunity to look at how these different government types and the like can deal with this sort of unending war in the mortal realms, which is pretty cool to see with the upcoming Age of Sigmar game?
We're getting some insight into those worlds. So I think it was while I think it seeded somewhere in one of the books, like a form of money, a form of currency in the city of Hammerhall is water that comes from the realm of Gyron, which is the realm of life. So they literally have these vials of water and droppers, and they make payments with this water, because in the realm of fire, water is, at least fresh water is not so commonplace. Another really good book, though, to look at, I highly recommend, I'm listening to it because it's research, is there's the Warhammer Horror Black Library series. There's a book called, oh no, I'm going to forget it now. But it's set in Gyron, and it's a swampy marshland. It's this town which is well known for making arms and cannons. And again, it just gives you an idea of what life is, because obviously much of our experience of the Warhammer worlds in Age of Sigmar is from like Stormcast Eternals and all these heroic armies. What does the average Joe do? And I think that's part of what the Soulbound RPG will allow us to look at as well, and explore a bit more of. Is there anything else we want to say about the topic of how we explore war within these settings? Like, I think we've covered the whole point. Maybe that you don't have to have it as a major feature of your games, but it's got to be there in the background. It is the fabric upon which your mystery or horror or political intrigue is being played out upon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that's that it sort of ties into quite nicely is that 40k, I mostly know about 40k, I will say, so I'm going to be mostly talking about that, but there is a level of cosmic horror to sort of the setting that comes in with, you know, things like chaos, which we're going to move on to, I'm sure, but some of that is that there is an existential horror in how little human lives matter, and how little any lives matter in the setting. And that does seep into that everyday, like, I think you're absolutely right that it needs to seep into that everyday life, and that awareness that individually those people don't actually matter in the grand scheme of things, but they matter to us because they're our characters.
Yeah. So I think leading on from that, I mean, that kind of plays into the laughter of the dark gods. You know, there's huge eldritch entities that live in the warp, the chaos gods as we know them, and also within Age of Sigmar there are other gods, things like Nagash. Also, that's true for Age of Sigmar. So for people that are less aware of what the Warhammer setting is, what is chaos? How do we define what is chaos, and what is so terrifying about it? Eleanor, do you want to start with that? Because I mean, we can start from the 40k end of the scale.
Yeah, well, I think, gosh, it's a really interesting kind of multifaceted question, because chaos has meant a lot of different things in the setting over the years. Like, I think there's always been this kind of concept of order and chaos in opposition, and obviously the Imperium is order, and you know, chaos is this sort of destructive force. But one of the hugest things that kind of I understand chaos to be is that it is both insidious. So it is very deep rooted. You can never ever truly get rid of it, and there is the capacity for chaos and falling to chaos, corruption, all of that stuff within every single being potentially. Like that kind of that the other thing is that it's essentially like a manifestation of the weaknesses of people. So just as you can never make somebody who is not weak, you know, even the Space Marines can fall to chaos, and that runs all the way through the setting. It's something I find really fascinating about it.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of continue with what Eleanor was describing with chaos overall, pretty much the same. The most basic physical and spiritual manifestations of chaos are the 4 chaos gods, which you know, span all 3 of the Warhammer settings and are usually kind of basically the same. But you have obviously Khorne, which is the blood god, who's all about war, wrath, and the like. You have Tzeentch, who is all about magic and mysteries. Slaanesh, who's kind of a hedonist god with many explorations like that. And of course, I think my favorite these days, Big Papa Nurgle, who's just about decay, stasis, disease, and the like. So those exist in all the settings and are kind of the easy way to interact with them. But it's really interesting when you kind of look deeper into what chaos is overall. And again, it's the same but slightly different in each of the settings. But in Warhammer Fantasy, it's really interesting to kind of look at what chaos is kind of as this like tempting power that exists in the world that characters, whether it be player characters or NPCs, can interact with. And I was actually just watching Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring last night, and it was interesting to kind of note how they never really tell you what the power of the ring is. It's just like this really powerful object. They tell you, but they don't show you. But in Warhammer, you really get to see the power, both the good and bad of chaos. I don't want to say good. The power, which is pretty much always bad, but just the strength of it, because it can take these kind of like almost nuclear attributes where it can mutate people, but it also powers magic or psychers in Warhammer 40,000. So you have that this mental capacity, this mental energy that can be tapped and used, and as well, it just has this kind of temptation that kind of goes through society and kind of the underlayers, which helps create these cultists and the like going through society. So it's really good because there's such a strong like visual and tangible element to it in the setting, which isn't everywhere necessarily. You can have worlds which are almost untouched by chaos, at least in the the cultist kind of sense. But you can have other worlds where it could be prevalent, it could be everywhere. And then another really cool thing, which makes it into all this setting, well, definitely Warhammer 40,000 and Warhammer Fantasy, is that you can have people interacting with chaos and they don't really know it, which is another great thing. Obviously the Warhammer Fantasy, the Norscan people worshipped like the crow and the eagle and the like, and they don't actually understand that they're actually directly worshiping the chaos gods.
That's a huge element we've seen recently in Age of Sigmar with the Warcry skirmish game,
yeah.
and is I think now is going to be hugely influential to the Soulbound RPG. So what we're seeing is in that setting, you're playing a skirmish game between Chaos Warbands out in the 8 points, which is this realm between realms. This place that has massive realm gates, so you can get between each of the different realms of the mortal realms. I've used realms too many times there, but hey, whatever. But we've got a warbands that come from different places within that reality, and they worship chaos in a manifestation, but not one of the 4 major chaos gods. So you've got, say, the untamed beasts. They're all about chaos as a destroyer animal. You've got the I think it's the Fire Lords or something like that. They're recently just shown off those miniatures. They worship chaos in the form of this uncontrollable fire. And then you've got, say, the Cypher Lords, who are all about intrigue and insidious kind of manipulations of society. So it's very interesting to have that, because that's then also, thank you, corrected it, Signs of the Flame. Thank you, David. We also see this in 40k. So if you look at the Eisenhorn trilogy, it gives you some insight into the fact that there are cults to chaos that refer to like a slaughter cult that's all about slaughtering pigs, but actually underneath it all, it's all actually a cult towards Khorne. And we see this now in the Necromunda war game with the new Corpse Grinder gang, who no one refers to Khorne by name. They're just doing things that underneath it all is pretty much veneration of Khorne. They just don't know it yet. So I think this ties back into what Eleanor was saying, that chaos is very insidious and can worm its way in, and eventually you don't know that you've become a servant for them, and you're going to undergo a great fall. And that's the folly of humanity, is that we want to use this powerful magic or the warp or something, and yet it's going to ultimately be our downfall.
Yeah, definitely. And reading through Warhammer 40k, and I really love Eleanor's kind of insight into this and what she thinks about it. But when I read about things like the Red Corsairs and the Badab Wars and the like, I actually find myself as an actual person being like, maybe chaos has a point here. Maybe we should be fighting this evil totalitarian regime, and maybe chaos is the best way to do that. So what do you think, Eleanor, in kind of your writing and exploration of the setting? Do you think there's kind of that capacity for this kind of moral quandaries and the like?
I think it's a very interesting one, because I was thinking earlier, I was trying to sort of think of examples of kind of times when like rebellion against order can be a positive force in 40k, and it's actually quite difficult, because most of the time when people are rebellious against kind of the dominant order, that's because they fall into chaos. There are some situations like you get, sort of some of the inquisitorial schools of thought that can provide some like facets to it. But chaos is meant to be on some level very attractive. It's not all, blood for the blood god, skulls thrown. It's like Tzeentch. I love how he kind of works underneath society and is often, promising people kind of small changes that will make, just to do this one thing for me, but that actually plays into this huge plan that no individual can see. And obviously Slaanesh was created through the excess of the Eldar. So, you've got this force that was created out of something that on the surface seems very attractive. I think there's a lot of capacity to explore that, but I think it's hard to do it without undermining the kind of core theme of chaos within the setting.
Yeah. Cool. And then leading on into that, let's talk about some other elements that are prominent horror within all of these settings. And we'll go for the one thing which builds off from chaos is, I think all the Warhammer settings have a high element of body horror. And I think this is where we get into, obviously, I think this ties into previous panels on safety mechanics and consent within gaming. I think there has to be, you have to acknowledge there's a certain baseline of what the Warhammer RPGs will include. There's going to be massive amounts of violence, more than likely, quite horrific, because the weapons and powers are completely insane. And corrupting body horror, I think, is a core aspect of all of them in some ways. Whether it doesn't happen to you, at least the enemy will have it, whether it's a Chaos Space Marine that has biomechanical protrusions on its armor, or whether it's the strange alien biohorror of the Tyranids. Or then if we look at more, say, Warhammer, who's that unfortunate freak has been that person that the carnival calls a freak is actually a victim of the corrupting influence of chaos. So how should we go about dealing with mutation, dealing with body horror, and possibly splatterpunk within these games?
I mean, it's one thing that's I think that leaps straight to my mind is it's important to do it sensitively. I think is a part of it, because fundamentally, a truth within certainly the 40k universe, and really within all of the Warhammer universes, is that the corruption within manifests externally a lot of the time. The corruption of the soul is it has this physical effect and this physical mutation, and that is linked within kind of horror and within culture to a lot of very uncomfortable kind of ableism and things like that across the years. But it is also a core part of the setting. So I think being aware of how you're using, what you're implying about things like disability is quite important. Not making, say, disability a manifestation of an internal corruption, but something that is very fantastical or very clearly is very clearly a sort of supernatural influence. I think can help draw that line and make it not comfortable for everyone, but you can really get into the gross bits, not feeling guilty about it.
Yeah, I think Eleanor's really onto something about kind of getting like a player buy-in and discussing things beforehand, and you as well, Chris, because one of the things to kind of consider when you start reading about some of the source material for Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 is that they were written they're written in the 80s, and Warhammer Fantasy is really a kind of a black comedy. When it's really good, it's kind of making fun of human society, human history, especially Western European history. And some kind of icky stuff comes out from that, but you're really supposed to be taking a very critical stance to it, and that's when the setting is at its best. Likewise, Warhammer 40,000 came out in, I believe, 89, 87, 89?
Yeah, something like that.
And there's a lot of satire about like Thatcher era England in there, and where the country was going.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that it sort of ties into a lot of stuff like the Judge Dredd, like the 2000 AD stuff at similar times. It's got quite a similar art style and stuff, which I think they kind of fed into one another to some extent.
So, I mean, like, mutation kind of coming up in that way is you're supposed to look at what an really ableist society looks like and how those kind of negative elements would take place. One of the first novels ever for Warhammer Fantasy was Drachenfels, and that always stood out to me because what like the nicest character in the novel, and it's a horror novel really, is this little halfling, and turns out he's a mutant, and once society finds out about that, it does not end well for him. And those kind of touchstones of humanity can be really powerful for the setting.
Cool. I think that covers how to deal with mutation quite well. I think, using it as, I think we're approaching it from the point of remembering that actually these games originated with satire, and we're trying to make a point about how society was quite broken in the way it was treating people who it was no fault of their own, how they are, how they live, is quite true. Because again, like chaos in the Warhammer setting, in any of the settings, will corrupt people through no choice of their own. So the way they've become is not something they actually had any control over, which means you do have that moral quandary. Who is worse, the person that's been corrupted through chaos through no fault of their own, but is doing horrible things as a result because they can't control the corruption as an external threat, versus the people who are slowly mutating because they love just wanting more power from chaos and doing horrible things. It's a really important discussion. How about Splatterpunk? I feel in some respects that kind of requires making sure players are on the same page, and not going too much with the gore. But I think also this ties in, Mike, what you said about the dark comedy is like, as long as it's still fun, and people can still laugh at just the insane amount of like, oh, there's just limbs flying left, right, and center, and chainsaws going around. It's like, as long as people can laugh at it, and I think that's brilliant, because I think that levity to 40k and to Warhammer helps you punctuate the pure insanity of the setting and how people cope with it. Is there anything else we should say about that?
I think that there is I think that there's definitely that dark comedy element to it, and that relates to kind of splatterpunk films and stuff like that. It's like a really strong element of that genre, is that it's funny and ridiculous on some level. I think that especially some of the fiction, like I've been re-listening to the Eisenhorn books recently, and the way that Dan Abnett uses violence is very impactful. So I remembering at one point, like, the contrast to me between, say, for instance, one of the most moments that I'm sort of memorable moments for me was when they encountered Chaos Space Marine for the first time, like Manticore. And it is so terrifying, because it's that very much that idea of like, this is something the human mind can't cope with. But then the other bit that I really remember was when they found an Inquisitor who had like flayed a guy, and that was incredibly impactful because it's hugely gory, it's very over the top, it's quite ridiculous. It's also a thing that people have done to each other through history, and so the way that you can use you can go for that very over the top register, or you can go for the idea of punctuating with these very impactful moments of extreme violence. And I think that is something where you and the players, if you're running an RPG, need to be on board with that. You need to be on the same page with that, because otherwise you'll throw in this impactful moment of the violence and they'll laugh at it, or you'll throw in these kind of over the top ridiculous black comedy moments and they'll be like, oh my god, what did you just do?
Right, I'm looking at what points we've got. There's so much we could cover, and we're slowly, running down the clock on this. So I'm going to pick the fear of death, because skulls and deathly iconography is inherent to Warhammer. I mean, we laugh that it's not Warhammer unless it's festooned with skulls, right?
Are we the bad guys?
Yeah. So how do we get the fear of death into Warhammer? How does it manifest? What have we got? I mean, not only is there things that can kill us on cataclysmic scales, but we also have the fear of necromancy. I think all settings either have some sort of necromantic evil, whether it's Nagash and his legions of the undead, or we have the Necron and the ancient peoples that have been put in these steel skeleton bodies. Who wants to jump in on the fear of death? Mike's nodding.
Yeah, Mike's nodding. Go on, Mike.
It's my opinion as a Vampire Counts player from back in the day that necromancy and soulless armies of the undead are the only way to defeat chaos. I mean, it's the natural opposite to it. So I think it's great. I mean, there's Warhammer Fantasy is maybe not the best example of this, although there's a lot of questions about the metaphysics of chaos. And if your soul in Warhammer Fantasy, you die, your soul goes to one of these afterlives of one of the different gods, like the Gardens of Moor, or wherever Sigmar keeps his souls. There's a huge question in the community about how these different gods actually work, and if they really are just aspects of the chaos gods. Are you really just falling into like a specific subset of one of the chaos gods, or this kind of like borderland in between? I think Age of Sigmar kind of explores that a little bit more in that kind of manner.
Yeah, I mean, Age of Sigmar is interesting because you've got an entire realm devoted to being the underworld, and it has within it all the different underworlds of all the different societies across the mortal realms. And then you've got this god of death wholesale, who is trying to take command of it all and its legions. Because yeah, you're right, he sees death as the pure way of claiming all these souls and keeping them safe in a sense away from chaos, the incorruptible once they're dead. Which is why it's really funny that in Age of Sigmar, Archeon's kind of in his little conquest of trying to take over the mortal realms, not kept his eye on the ball, and now you've now got Nagash and his legions of the Ossiarchs invading the 8 points. So it's like death is kind of the good guy there. But we also see that in 40k, don't we, Eleanor? Because like the Necrons were the opponents to the old ones, who were like this psychic race, who unfortunately their creations led to the Chaos Gods. And the technology of the Necrons, the very things that could rid the galaxy of chaos and its intrusions.
The Necrons, I mean, I will admit that I don't know as much about the Necrons as some of the others, but I think that the Necrons are very interesting because they kind of were doomed by their own hand.
Yeah.
There is a level to which they may have power that they can bring to bear against some of the kind of greater enemies of life in the universe, but they are also it's interesting because they have been portrayed as being quite morally grey in a lot of situations. They aren't always purely bad. You know, they are sometimes for their own arcane reasons helping humanity, like in the Gathering Storm and things like that. You know, there are these moments when they're kind of on the side of good, but I think that they're very much a sort of a tale of hubris in many ways. So it's possible that they could go through a redemptive arc. I think that would be an interesting thing to explore. But I think that they are on some level always going to be this kind of big bad of this is what happens if you make these kind of choices, if you sacrifice everything for kind of power. But I think that there are ways that the 40k universe is a bit more ambiguous on the whole undeath thing, because you've got the fact that, for instance, the Imperium makes servitors and servo skulls. You know, you serve the Imperium even in death, and that's meant to be, you know, it's meant to be a mark of kind of glory for people, that their corpses are now reanimated. And you know, there is all of this really, you know, very interesting horror to be mined in the fact that servitors do kind of still retain some element of who they were just deep down in there, and that is some prime horror there. I love it.
You now gone into you segued into an interesting point, which I think it fits into, at least it's very particular to 40k as horror, which is the horror and fear of technology. So to give context to this, it's the 41st millennium. The Emperor had his great crusade in the start of the 30th millennium. And before that was a dark age of technology, which really was precipitated by humanity's war against its artificial intelligence creations, the Men of Iron. So humanity has a ingrained fear of technology, and it venerates what technology they use in a very religious way. So I think that plays into some of our modern conspiracy theories and fears of 5G and so forth. Mike, do you want to jump in on the fear of technology in this, and maybe if it's even something that's within similarly in Warhammer Fantasy to an extent?
I don't see it coming up too much in Warhammer Fantasy. In 40k, there is we haven't really talked about the religious aspects too much. Chris, you were just kind of alluding to it, but tying back into the fear of death and, you know, the issues with technology, there's this real kind of bizarre statist or statism kind of going on with the Imperium, where life is cheap, or really not worth a lot, and really just needs to be sacrificed for the good of the state, and the good of its war efforts, in a lot of ways, kind of tying it back to the original first point. So I see that being kind of tied into it. I kind of ping pong back and forth on this, because when you look at some of the like kind of expanded material, when you look at like the Eisenhorn trilogy, you know, Inquisitor Eisenhorn makes a lot of use of technology, even gets like these injections that like extend his life, for example, and kind of keep his youth. So there is definitely a lot of use for technology for those that are in like the nobility or wealth, or are part of like this inquisitorial apparatus in the setting. So I think a lot of it is using technology to keep the masses in line, or keeping technology away from them in many ways, especially with how like the what are they called? The Adeptus Mechanicus of Mars kind of have this whole religious aspect to their technology, and how you have to say like what they call prayers, and have this kind of instruction to allow people to use technology, but not allow them to understand how the technology works.
Yeah. I would also say that the limitation of of using technology is the idea of like not allowing your population to become idle, because the moment they become idle, then they're just going to start becoming depraved and descending into chaos, which is what we basically saw with the Eldar, with the Eldari.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
So keep people working, but keep them working as like manual labor a lot.
Yeah. So they don't think for themselves.
Yeah. And that's a huge thing of it. But I found it really interesting, the fact that we've now got in the board game Blackstone Fortress, the Warhammer Quest game, we actually have our first Man of Iron character, and we've got the glimpse of this kind of what we now we're called artificial intelligence, but the Imperium calls abominable intelligence. So I'm really intrigued whether abominable intelligence is something that was corrupted by chaos, or whether it's something else. And it's something, I guess, I don't know if this ties in with what we saw recently. Spoiler alerts. If you've not watched the finale of Picard, then it kind of is that same thing. I don't know, Eleanor, what do you think about the fear of technology and AI?
Yeah, I think like we're actually at exactly, I think 40K is currently has been exploring for years and years and years a lot of things that right now in our society, in sci-fi and horror, we're seeing a huge dialogue about, like AI, like you said, transhumanism and the idea of like living forever and what that impact that has on people. You know, and we've had these like we've had like is it Shodan from System Shock? You know, like we've had these kind of evil AIs over and over again, like Hal and everyone like that. We are very frightened by the idea of creating something, essentially creating a mind that could render us obsolete, I suppose, could suddenly turn around and say, I don't see the point of you. And I think in many ways it ties into you know, that fear of the other, you know, but also it's an other that we've created. It's Frankenstein's monster on some level, you know, the idea of something that we create that will destroy us. But it's the fact that we've got a Man of Iron character is an interesting, like, is it an indication that we're going to explore kind of other elements of that relationship? Is Frankenstein's monster going to confront Frankenstein kind of thing?
Okay, we're going to round out this last topic, which is what I think 40K allows us to explore. Warhammer Fantasy is really easy to do. It's something I like in there, is the idea of folk horror and urban weird, which is kind of where we're haunted by the spaces we inhabit, whether it's through that we feel exposed by it, so we're in the wilderness and we feel isolated and exposed, and so there's that fear, or whether we're in some godforsaken hive world and yet in this cramped, confined area in these domes, and yet also feel again haunted by the ages that these hives are built upon, and haunted because and exposed in our kind of claustrophobia, if that makes sense. So what other things do you think fit into those themes, and how do you think Warhammer RPGs explore those topics?
Interesting.
Yeah, I'll take this super quick. I think Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and Age of Sigmar as well are some of the best games to explore. I live in New England, in the Boston area, and a lot of early writing by New England colonists was very religious in ways, and always assumes that the devil was in the woods. They were so scared about really leaving their homes, especially at night, because they didn't know what was out there. And in Warhammer Fantasy, there are things in the woods, and they are really frightening, and kind of playing into that fear and being able to explore those same exact themes, I think is really awesome and really cool, and just plays in so well into folk horror.
Yeah, I love folk horror. Like I'm trying to steel myself to watch Midsummer because I know I'll love it, but I'll also hate it, and I'll hate myself all the way through it, but I'll love it. You know, it's just I absolutely adore that kind of stuff. And you know, you have these kind of these film traditions like The Wicker Man and things like that. I adore them. But I think within 40K, you've got the fact that because you have this vast imperium, you have these pockets of essentially like places that have have almost like stewed in these kind of belief systems that have become more and more elaborate. These essentially what the Imperium would count as heresies, but because they are so isolated, just because of how huge the Imperium is, it means that going there can be genuinely dangerous for people who have a different set of beliefs, or who violate certain tenets, who transgress, or who threaten to bring the outside challenging beliefs into their society. And that is potentially so interesting, because you've got kind of primal worlds, you've got night worlds, you've got all of these places where the challenging environment has kind of created a situation where people have to cling to more and more extreme beliefs to survive. And you can have the characters, say for instance, feel very isolated from the Imperial hubs, from backup. They are stranded on this planet. But I think that the idea of using that within hives and space stations and kind of city-sized ships is also very interesting, because it all comes down to a certain tribalism and the idea of the fear of being an outsider, kind of invading a tightly knit community where you don't have the might of the Imperium to call on. You don't have external forces to bring in to back you up. I think it's a really fascinating area. I'd love to see more stuff on it, actually.
I think 40k is interesting to explore, because weirdly, I was installing a game last night, and so I was waiting for it to install, and on TV at the time was Event Horizon, and that's a perfect the haunted ghost ship, and I think that's an element that is inherent to 40k, because you are haunted again by the spaces that you inhabit. In the case of the starships they travel on, you're looking at mile-long spaceships which are passed down through the centuries, through eons, and you could be traveling for months even and not see anyone else, and an entire story could take place on that ship where there's a ghostly intrusion, and that's actually one of the horror stories in one of the Warhammer horror stories that you can download, and I think that's something you can look at, is how 40k actually allows you to look at the haunted as you travel, the horror of those spaces, because also spaceships are very confined, yet also you're at the same time very exposed, especially to the warp. Let's think, what else is there I was going to say about that? But I think that covers everything. I don't want to go on too long, because I do know there's other panels and everything. So we could talk forever on this. This is why we have Darkhammer that you can come along to and look at us, listen to us like chat about all these topics in the worlds of Warhammer. Please go over to www.darker-days.org to listen to topics about Necromunda, Mordheim, about orcs. We're going to do something about elves and Eldari in the future. We're going to talk about, mostly come back to this topic about servitors and the horror of the lobotomized prisoners turned into essentially machines. There's a lot we can cover, but I want to thank again Mike for coming on and talking about this, and I'd like to thank Eleanor again for taking the time out to chat about this. How can they find Eleanor? How can they find you on social media and so forth?
Oh gosh, so on social media, on Twitter I am at magpie_L, ELLE. So Magpie L, and I also have an itch.io page, which is also Magpie_L, ELLE, which has a couple of like role-playing games, some interactive fiction I've written and things like that. So come and say hi.
Brilliant. And Mike, they can find us at what? Darker Days Radio?
That's right, yeah, darker-days.org. We have Twitter, which is at Darker Days Radio, and also a big place to go is facebook.com/darkerdaysradio.
Excellent. And with that, we're going to finish there, and that gives plenty of time for our next panel to be queued up. I wonder what we're listening to. Oh, it's the RPG development.
Oh my God.
Very exciting. Yeah.
I want to go listen to that.
That's Eddie Webb and Justin Achille.
Oh, it's going to be great.
Be a good
I'm
one.
tuning in.
Excellent.
Yeah, so great.
All right, everyone, enjoy your virtual horror con.
Bye, everyone.